All right, welcome back, everybody, to another bonus episode of the Building Lifelong Athletes podcast. I'm Jordan Rennicke, your host. Thanks so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it. Last week, we talked about a couple kind of common questions or myths that people talk about on social media in terms of cholesterol. And we're going to do the same thing today again. We're going to go through a couple points or questions or things that I commonly see in social media and talk about why I think they don't necessarily hold up to the scrutiny that some people think they do, and kind of just my opinion on that. So once again, this is more kind of off the cuff, me ranting a little bit and just kind of talking about things, but I hope you enjoy it. So the first one we're going to tackle today is some people say that, hey, some studies show that people with higher cholesterol live longer than those who have lower cholesterol. So like the logic is therefore higher cholesterol improves longevity. So it's kind of like what's called the cholesterol paradox, meaning why is it in some studies you see people with higher cholesterol living longer? Well, first things first, you got to look at which studies they're talking about, right? So first, like we've talked about, and we go back and watch one of our previous podcasts on like studies and how we design studies. All these studies they talk about are always association studies. So meaning they're kind of looking usually prospective or cohort or whatnot, meaning, hey, we look at these people at this point in their life. So kind of, later in life, and they have the LDL of this, and they seem to be living longer than the people of LDL this. Like, oh, well, what's happening? Well, that's exactly the question, is what is happening? We're not sure about anything at all. These are all just association studies, can't prove anything. So when people jump and say, well, LDL is better for you living longer, you can't prove anything by any of those studies. So all they're saying is like, hey, in some situations, it seems that LDL for some people, when they're a little higher, they seem to have maybe some potential benefit. We'll see why that is, whatnot. But first things first, like these are all association studies. Zero causality can be judged from this. So if anyone says like, oh, higher LDL causes you to live longer, like they don't understand science, like plain and simple. And they're using, the studies in a manipulative type of way. And so that's the first thing. And then on top of that, I always tell people like, there's a ton of evidence of statin trials, PCSK9 trials, ezetimibe trials, all these things where we're lowering our LDL. And like, we don't see people just like dying like left and right. Like, if having this low LDL is like a really terrible thing, then we'd like see people have like really bad outcomes in these studies. And we don't, we see the opposite. We see them having really good outcomes, and it improves their cardiovascular risk and decreases their events and all those things. And so it's like one of those things where it's like, okay, something's just discordant there. And then if you look at the Mendelian randomization data, right? So these are people who have super low LDL from birth. So like they've had this low LDL their whole life, and they have the lowest incidence of heart disease, and they have really good long-term survival. Once again, we're not seeing these people just die young because they have super low LDL. So once again, these are showing all these different exposures. Like people with LDL, like lowering your LDL, it does not seem to lead to this increased risk of mortality. Like I said, it's not matching up with these association studies. And so what can be accounting for that? Well, a couple different things. First of all, studies don't account for a lifetime exposure of elevated cholesterol, right? It's only a snapshot. So it's very possible that there's a little bit of a survivorship bias. Survivorship bias meaning the people that we see here who have high cholesterol, those might only be a fraction of the people, right? There might be a lot of people who had really high LDL who had heart attacks or strokes or things, or died earlier. And so we don't see those people. And so like I said, we don't know anything about the total group of people with high cholesterol. Just at that point, there are some people, and we know that's going to happen, right? We know that some people who have high LDL don't get heart attacks. Some people who have low LDL do get heart attacks. Life's an imperfect world. We do not have a perfect understanding of what's going on there. Once again, we're just trying to mitigate risks in different ways that we can, right? So kind of having multiple buckets, have our eggs in different baskets. So on top of that, not only do we have this survivorship bias, but chronic conditions like cancer, liver disease, cachexia, organ failure, all these things can lead to lower cholesterol. And so, it's most likely that might be playing a factor as well. And then also, like I said, if you have all these issues lowering cholesterol, meaning you have cancer, end organ disease, so really frail people who are going to unfortunately pass away, they're more likely to die, and they have lower cholesterol. So that kind of could be potentially skewing some things there. And so, like I said, that's kind of one for me. Like when I see people say like, oh, like people live longer with that, like that doesn't seem to be the case. It doesn't make sense. We have no like hard data explain it. If you go back to our causality lecture that I've talked about, in terms of causality, let's look at this. Okay, it's just association studies, so check one right there. We don't have corroborating evidence from that. We don't have a mechanistic reason necessarily. Like, obviously I'm not saying it's impossible, but it just, the things don't add up. And for me, I'm not saying like, oh, I need my LDL to be high to live longer. Like that just doesn't seem to be the case based on the mountains and mountains of data we have of people going on lowering, LDL lowering medications and issues, things like that, and not having issues. And so that's just kind of where I stand on that. Okay, next I want to talk about a topic that people talk about all the time online, man. It is so prevalent. It's that particle size is everything, right? So the logic is that there's two different types of LDL, essentially two main groups. There's a type A, which is a fluffy LDL, and there's a type B, which is small, dense. So what a lot of people say is that type 1 or type A, which is, quote unquote fluffy, this LDL is not atherogenic. I mean, this is essentially harmless. It just kind of floats around, does its thing. It's like, oh, boo, boo. It's just, unassuming, doesn't cause an issue. Whereas type B is the problem. Type B are these small, dense ones that we see typically in the setting of insulin resistance. And I will be the first to admit, there is some data that type B is more atherogenic potentially. But that being said, a lot of times it's due to particle size. And so, for example, there's billions of lipoproteins in the circulating bloodstream, right? So tons and tons and tons of them. And so when they penetrate the wall of the blood vessel, right, it starts this inflammatory process and it starts atherosclerosis. So the question is, I mentioned earlier, what can get across this membrane? Well, lipoproteins smaller than 70 nanometers can penetrate the vessel wall. So 70 nanometers is like our size. Okay, if you're less than that, you can get in there. Type A, which are the quote unquote big fluffy ones, right? They're bigger than 25 nanometers, average about 27 nanometers. And so once again, 70 is the threshold, so that's how wide it is. And these lipoproteins are like 27. So like they clearly can fit in there. So it's not the case at all that they can't cause atherosclerosis. That's not true. Type B though are significantly smaller. They're less than 25 nanometers. And so they're super, super small. But once again, type A, still plenty small to get into vessel walls. And so another reason why I think this is a little misguided, and I'm going to give you an example here of two different patients, right? We have, let's say, patient A and patient B, both with an LDL of, let's say, around 140. So obviously elevated, don't love that. But let's say we have type B. Let's see, they're typically, like I said, when we see type B people with these small, dense LDLs, they typically have a high risk, but usually it's because they have more LDL particles around, right? So if we have type A and type B, they have the same amount of cholesterol, LDL of 140, right? If you have a small, smaller size LDL particle, you're going to need more of those particles to carry the exact same amount of cholesterol in the A pattern. So once again, if type A is bigger and fluffy, or maybe it takes only 10 of those particles to get to 140, that's a complete made up number, but let's say 10 to get to 140, whereas type B might need 20 of those particles to make up 140 on the LDL. So that's one's the thing. It's not necessarily any more risky. It's just that a lot of times to make up the difference, the type B patterns are a little more, there's more of them. And so that's the thing. A lot of times if we take ApoB into account, going back to our ApoB friend, which is, accounting of all of our VLDLs, LDL, atherogenic lipoproteins, all that stuff, once those are taken into account, it seems like the risk kind of disappears when we're actually looking at the particle count. So, when they say a particle is a particle, that's kind of what they mean. They're saying that a particle is a particle, meaning we have one particle and another one here. They both are small enough to get in and cause damage. It's just a matter of the total number of particles that we have. That's what we worry about. So once again, there are people who out there who are hawking saying, hey, you need to get these fancy tests. You need to get look at all these particle sizes and everything. Like I said, there is a time and place for those and it can be helpful. But at the end of the day, like I said, I would not waste money on specific size. We can look at ApoB and we should be fine. All right, the next question or topic I'll talk about is some people say that, hey, we don't see much improvement in the elderly. They're our most vulnerable and weak. Therefore, statins don't work, right? And we should expect to see them in the biggest benefits in our elderly. Why do not? Well, let's talk about it here. Essentially, first of all, we think that lifetime exposure matters. And so by the time someone's already elderly, most of the damage is already done. So therefore, we wouldn't expect to see as much benefit or change at that time, right? So you need a much, much bigger improvement in cholesterol to see a difference. And so, like I said, if you're, had a 60, 70, 80 years of lifetime accumulation, in order to see a change in the medication, you probably have to have an enormously big change in your LDL cholesterol. And they've actually seen in some studies, they do see improvement in LDL by such a great degree that it improves outcomes even in the elderly. But that being said, not every trial shows that. And so, like I said, a lot of times it's his lifetime exposure and we need a much bigger improvement to see that. And on top of that, people also ask the question, well, people who have heart attacks can have normal cholesterol. And so people with normal cholesterol, they're still hospitalized, they have heart attacks, therefore LDL can't be the problem, right? Like, well, we know for a fact that about, a third of heart disease occurs in those with normal cholesterol. Like I said, so I know people be like, well, Jordan, that doesn't mean that means the LDL hypothesis is wrong. No, it just means that everything's not perfect, right? We're not saying that that's the only thing that matters. But like I said, we see a pretty consistent increase in risk when we start increasing our total cholesterol and our LDL. So like I said, it's not one-to-one. We know that. I've said that so many times. But that being said, as we start to increase, we tend to see a bigger prevalence. And so the question we also have is what defines normal, right? So for a total cholesterol, we've used this cutoff for 200, right? 200 for a long time. And it seems to be pretty much arbitrary, in the world of like blood pressure, right? So we used to have blood pressure like, oh, you could probably be like 150 over 90. It's not a problem. And now we've kind of gone like 140 over 90 and then like 130 over 80 and 120. It's like we're just kind of going down and down and down. So blood pressure has changed as we've learned more. And so, we might be experiencing this right now in the world of lipoproteins and cholesterol metabolism as well. In terms of the cholesterol, a normal cholesterol might not be 200. It might be significantly lower. LDL, we might find that our goal shouldn't be 130 or 120. It should be significantly lower than that. Like I said, we know that around 70 is the area where we start to see halting progression to plaque. So maybe 70 is actually our normal, right? And then we're actually all higher than we should be. And so that's kind of the thing. It's like, how are we defining this? And so desirable LDL is probably lower than what we recommend. Like, so that's a thing. And then on top of that, when people say, LDL, we have normal LDL, what's going on? How do we have heart attacks? There's something called discordance into play. So what that means is discordance means when there's LDL that appears normal, but you may have lots and lots of particles. So for example, of patients who have insulin resistance or diabetes, they have lots of those pattern B, small, dense lipoproteins. And like I said, they might have a quote unquote normal cholesterol, but they have lots and lots of particles. And like I just mentioned before, particle count seems to matter a lot. And so LDL could be normal, but we still have a elevated ApoB, and so we have an elevated risk. And so that could be playing a factor as well. On top of that, also LDL is something called a negative acute phase reactant. So what this is something like vitamin D, testosterone, albumin. During physiologic stress, things like, a heart attack or a stroke, infection, when this happens, we can see those things like vitamin D, LDL, they can go down and this number can markedly decrease. And so yet another reason for why when people have heart attacks, like in that acute setting, their LDL might be lower because they're going under physiologic stress. So there's numerous reasons as to why LDL might be normal in the setting of a heart attack. And once again, it's not perfect. It's not one-to-one, but once we know that as we're increasing the particle numbers, we tend to have a higher risk of having a heart attack or stroke. All right, next one is that people say, hey, if I have a CAC of 0, it means I don't have atherosclerosis. I'm good to go. Don't need a statin, don't need nothing. I'm good. Well, atherosclerosis actually exists on a spectrum. We know that it can exist with calcium, it can exist without, but if you don't have calcium, then we're not going to see it on the CAC score, but that doesn't mean you don't have it. Calcium is a later process in atherosclerosis, so it's super advanced by the time you get there. Like I said, if we're getting a CAC, we use the Gaxton units. That's kind of how we score it. If you have 0, it means no calcium. Great. That means you don't have any calcified plaque. If your score is 1 in 99, that's mild. 100 to 399, moderate. 400 plus is severe. But what a CAC of 0 does not mean there's no atherosclerosis. It does seem to have an impact in terms of a lower short-term risk compared to those with a higher score. So that's pretty standard. If you have a CAC of 0 versus a CAC of 500, big difference there. But that being said, about 1/3 to 1/4 of heart disease and complications in younger people occur with a CAC of 0. So once again, CAC was 0, but we still have heart disease and can have heart disease complications. How is that possible? Well, we don't necessarily have the calcium yet in atherosclerosis. So we can have the soft plaques that we see that aren't calcified yet, don't show up on the CT when we're doing the CAC, but it's still very much there. And so like I said, that's one thing to think about. And then on top of that too, we can also see calcium in other circumstances, just of noting here. So like a calcium score, if you're on a statin, it's pretty well known that we pretty much don't count calcium scores if you're on a statin because statins can increase some calcification. Also high intensity exercise can as well. And so we're not necessarily sure what's going on. But that being said, this setting, it seems like in the statin and exercise, it may be more of a quote unquote stabilizing effect. We're not necessarily sure. But long story short, you can have plaque in your artery and that's not calcified, and that's very possible. And that being said, if you do get a CAC score of 0 and you're elderly, that is something that we typically is a little more reassuring. So, like we would expect to see when someone's elderly to have some sort of positive CAC score, meaning we'll see some sort of calcified atherosclerosis. If we don't, feel pretty good about that. And the guidelines kind of say, hey, we can kind of base some recommendations off of that. But that being said, if you have a CAC of 0, that is not a get out of jail free card. There's lots and other things we need to consider. And on top of that, also considering that you might have uncalcified plaque inside your artery. So once again, not a get out of jail free card. All right, next might be that saying, hey, I don't want to be on statins. That's going to ruin my gains. Meaning, hey, I know that statins can have some, muscle symptoms and that can happen. And I'm already using my muscles a lot when working out. So I'm worried and I don't want to take them. Well, there's no line there. Myalgias can happen. So can myopathy, which is more muscle damage. Myalgia is just kind of muscle soreness, whereas myopathy is actually muscle damage. That can happen, but it's much more rare. And we've talked about it before. That being said, we're not actually sure that statins cause much more side effect than actual placebos. In studies, there's people who were blinded, and in the same time in the placebo group, they seem to have the same amount of myalgias as those on statins. So the people who took the placebo versus people who took the statins seem to have the same amount of symptoms. So pretty much I saw one study saying up to 80 or 90% of symptoms that were reported from taking a statin may be due to this nocebo effect, meaning people thinking they're going to have a bad outcome. So on top of that, studies don't seem to, we don't seem to see decrease in muscle strength, aerobic capacity, or any other objective measure of muscle function. So it doesn't seem to be like it actually is causing bad outcomes. That being said, obviously can have some muscle symptoms. Gotta, work with that in terms of if you're having issues, switch things up, switch dosing, switch medication, do whatever. There's lots of things we can do, but it doesn't seem that if you're starting a statin, you're automatically doomed. You're not going to get any gains anymore. All right, so that's all the questions I'm going to talk about today. Just a little sampling there, just a couple of them, but I really hope you enjoyed it. If you found this helpful, it would mean the world. And if you liked, commented, subscribed, or share this with a friend, that would really help get this out. Also, if you want to hear more from me throughout the week, I do have a newsletter that I'll send kind of talking about research articles that I look at. But like I said, I really hope you enjoyed this. Thanks so much for stopping by. Now get off your phone, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you later.